Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. For those of you who are just joining us tonight for the first time, you can catch Truth on the Tracks every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.TV. Now, before we get into anything else, we've got a lot of topics to try to get to tonight, and I really am going to try to get to all of them. Of course, I want to talk about Syria, but I also want to bring up something we haven't talked about in a while, and that is genetically modified foods and the anti-GMO movement. I also want to bring up the Ferguson situation, and of course, by the time you hear this, it's going to be early December. The show's being recorded on December 3rd, so well in advance of when you hear it, but the Ferguson riots, the Michael Brown case, all of this stuff is still very much in the national consciousness and probably will be by the time you hear this radio show. But we need to talk about that because it's not necessarily the main aspects of what the mainstream media is talking about with Ferguson that I want to get into, and hopefully we'll have time to do that. But before we do, I want to go ahead and get the plugging aspect of the show out of it, the panhandling, out of the way. So I want to encourage you to follow my work as it comes out at the websites that I write for. Activistpost.com, theantimedia.org. Those are the two websites where you can find my work, or most of my work, as it's posted there. And, of course, you can also see my work at Irrelevant Paradigm, at naturalblaze.com. You'll also be able to find some of my work as it's being posted on a number of other websites out there. I think Realities Watch is now going to be posting a lot of my work as well. So you can follow my work at all those websites, but you can also go to BrandonTurbeville.com, and that is the website where I post all of my articles, all of my interviews, all of the archive versions of this show, and all of the relevant information there. There is a tab for my books. You can find my books. And there is a new tab. We've added a new tab, the Events tab. So you can click on the Events tab to see any speaking engagements or book signings, appearances, or whatever that I'm going to be doing in the future. You can find it there. And in fact, I will be doing a speaking engagement. I'll be doing a lecture that will last from 30 to 45 minutes. It will take place in Mullen, South Carolina, and it will take place at Coffee Etc. That is 203 South Park Street, Mullen, South Carolina, 29574. So again, that's 203 South Park Street, Mullen, South Carolina, 29574, and that is Coffee Etc. in Mullen, South Carolina. So the event will be at 8 p.m. It's free and open to the public. Space is limited, so get there early if you can. I will be talking about Syria. It's called The Road to Damascus, Terrorism and Destabilization in Syria. So it'll go on for about 30 to 45 minutes of me talking. There will be PowerPoint slides and so forth. There will also be a 15 to 30 minute question and answer session. Of course, I'll be there to sell you books and sign the books and to chat with you afterwards if you are available, if you come out to see the talk. Great way to network with other like-minded people, and a great way to get informed as well. So come on out and bring your friends, bring your family, and tell them to bring friends and family as well. So that is out of the way. I've got to mention that we expect some big things for the website soon. I expect some more improvements to the website. Hopefully, if what I want to happen pans out, there will be a lot of improvements there. We're also working on getting the books on Amazon, getting the books on Kindle, and all other kinds of digital readers and that sort of thing as well. Now, the topics for tonight. I guess we should start with the topic of Syria. So we'll step back a bit, all the way back into November, and we will talk about the Iranian question, right? The article that I did for Activist Post, Obama to Iran, stop fighting ISIS and start fighting ISIS. It sums up the way that Iran is being treated by the United States here. And basically we have this report from the Wall Street Journal on November 6th. that Barack Obama had secretly written a letter to Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei asking and encouraging him to join America in its fight against the Islamic State. Now we could stop right there and do an entire show on how the United States is not actually fighting ISIS and how it's actually funding and controlling ISIS, but we won't do that because we've done it so many times in the past. But this Wall Street Journal report was based on information provided by unnamed sources, and it indicated that the letter was sent in mid-October, and that it, quote, described a shared interest in fighting Islamic State militants in Iraq and Syria, and appeared aimed at both buttressing the campaign against Islamic State and nudging Iran's religious leader closer to a nuclear deal, end quote. The journalist also stated that the letter had stressed that any cooperation against the Islamic State was contingent upon Iran reaching a comprehensive agreement with the relevant powers on the future of the nuclear program, Iran's nuclear program, ahead of the scheduled meeting that took place on November 4th regarding Iran's nuclear capabilities. Now we know also, since the date of the show is December 3rd when I'm recording, we know that this decision, that this meeting has been pushed, I think, 7 months ahead. So we're kind of back to where we were when this article was written. Now, the White House did not officially confirm the letter's authenticity. In fact, it's known, though, that Obama and Ayatollah have had communication on the subject of the Islamic State before. And this is where it gets ironic. His previous communication also took the form of a secret letter, and it was not acknowledged by the foreign ministry. But it was initiated by the government of Iran, suggesting that the United States and Iran work together in order to defeat the Islamic State. All right, that sounds reasonable, right? Well, that suggestion was rejected by the U.S. State Department. So it was reported by the BBC in September 2014, September of this year, that Ayatollah Khamenei had authorized his top commander to coordinate military operations with the United States as well as Iraqi and Kurdish forces to fight the Islamic State. Now, we see that the Iranian Foreign Ministry denied the veracity of those reports and about the letter, but subsequently Iranian President Hassan Rouhani stated that Iran was open to the idea of working with the United States to combat the Islamic State. So we even have this report from the Daily Beast in September of this year regarding Rouhani's statement to the General Assembly of back on September 25th. And this is what he says. He says, "We are determined to continue our confidence-building approach and our transparency in the nuclear negotiations. If our interlocutors are equally motivated and flexible, then Iran and the West can start cooperating on very important regional issues such as combating violence and extremism." And of course he means the Islamic State. Now, even before Rouhani's statement to the General Assembly, the United States was making it clear that the United States was not interested in cooperating with Iran against the Islamic State. The State Department spokeswoman Marie Harf, I guess we'll call her Marie Barf, right? We are not going to coordinate military action or share intelligence with Iran and have no plans to do so. She also said that they would not be coordinating their action together. Well, the United States did request assistance from Iran to combat ISIS, and that request was relayed by Secretary of State Skull and Bones John Kerry himself, and this was reported by the LA Times in September of this year. Iran rejected those attempts, that fake fig leaf from John Kerry to cooperate in the battle against the Islamic State. Iran rejected it, and it was openly rejected by Ayatollah Khamenei. He said the U.S. ambassador in Baghdad had requested a meeting with his Iranian counterpart, so the Iranian ambassador, right, the U.S. ambassador in Baghdad requested a meeting with the U.S. ambassador, with the Iranian ambassador, to discuss coordination between the United States and Iran to defeat the ISIS militants. Well, allegedly, right? This is what Khamenei has to say after being released from the hospital. He says, "I opposed the U.S. request and told them we will not cooperate with the Americans on the issue because their intent and hands are not clean. How is it possible for us to cooperate with the Americans under such circumstances?" And that's relatively astute for a world leader to say that, because the truth is the American hands and intent are not clean. What he's referring to here is the fact that this is duplicity, that the United States is not acting in good faith. The United States is not interested in destroying ISIS. So, Khamenei also said that Iran rejected the request from Kerry for cooperation, and that this request was conveyed personally from Kerry to the Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif. Khamenei says, "Iran has voiced its opposition to being a party to that coalition from the very beginning. The Americans' coalition is nonsense." Well, it is. It is nonsense. The question is, why are two countries who both allegedly oppose ISIS and who are both allegedly fighting ISIS entirely unwilling to coordinate with one another in order to defeat ISIS? Well, you could complicate this issue somewhat, but the answer is actually somewhat simple. The reason for the inability of these two countries to coordinate with each other against ISIS is because one of the countries does not want to defeat ISIS, and that is the United States. The United States does not want to defeat ISIS. For all his very obvious faults, Khamenei, a dictator, absolutely, a brutal regime, absolutely, repressive regime, absolutely, religious theocracy, absolutely. He is correct when he says that the hands of the U.S. are not clean and that they're not genuine in their intent. The truth is that the U.S. and NATO would prefer that Iran join a coalition that sees Iran following the orders of NATO and the dictates of NATO, all at the same time that Iran is being crushed under sanctions and that it's being pressured unfairly over its non-existent nuclear weapons program, all while Israel, of course, is completely allowed to produce whatever nuclear weapons that it wants. The United States and NATO do not want to partner against ISIS. They want to dupe, and Iran is not willing to play into that. We also got to point out that the United States has targeted Syrian civilians, Syrian government oil refineries, Syrian grain silos, other forms of Syrian infrastructure. While the United States has been doing that, Iran has actually committed a small fighting force of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps inside Iraq for the purposes of defeating ISIS. So while the United States is attacking Syrian infrastructure under the guise of fighting ISIS, the Iranians are actually committing troops to fighting ISIS. So whatever Iran's internal situation is, whether it's a dictatorship, whatever, it's clear that the country is serious about destroying the Sunni terrorists, ISIS, right? Remember, Iran is Shia. So they have a vested interest, being a religious dictatorship, have a vested interest in stopping the Sunni terrorists, because the Sunni terrorists, of course, are going to be used inside Iran, as well as some of the Shiite militias as well are going to be used to try to foment a rebellion there. We know, again, we've been through this over and over, the U.S. has trained, armed, directed, funded, assisted all of the terrorists that have been fighting in Syria since the beginning of the crisis. When the airstrikes did fully begin against ISIS in both Syria and Iraq, it was clear that the strikes were aimed at protecting big oil and protecting big oil's infrastructure and destroying the infrastructure that belonged to the Syrian government and the Syrian people, not defeating ISIS, right? So we had this bomb-induced death squad herding which created a situation in which the death squads left certain areas that were being bombed ahead of the bombs, and then they were driven into positions in other places, in other strategic locations. In other words, their numbers began to turn into swarms in these other locations, areas like Kobane, also known as Ain al-Arab, the Arab Spring, the real spring, not the phony color revolution. So we won't go into this much more and repeat ourselves as we've done on a number of occasions here on this show and in the articles, but suffice it to say that the United States does not want to defeat ISIS, but it does want to continue to use ISIS as its Arab Legion against Middle Eastern governments, whether that's Iraq, Syria, Iran, all of them. So this olive branch, this offer of cooperation is nothing more than an attempt at duping Iran and providing cover for NATO, this attempted diplomatic cover, to cover up its true motives, which is to destroy Iran in the future. So that's wise of Khamenei to try and reject that false overture. So we've also got we got a few minutes here, so we could talk about Baghdadi, right? This was an article I did November 13th, so it's dated. This week in the movies, Baghdadi wounded, will he return? Over at Activist Post. And we won't go into too much detail here because Baghdadi has already resurfaced. But there were reports, of course, that Baghdadi had been wounded. So there were reports coming by CNN, which is, a discredited organization, especially in terms of the area of the Syrian crisis. But these reports by CNN were that Khaled al-Obeidi, Iraq's Minister of Defense, said that Baghdadi, you remember Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, had been wounded in an airstrike that took place in Mosul on Friday, November 7th. Obeidi also stated that Baghdadi's deputy Musalem al-Turkmani had been killed in the strike, but the Iraqi Interior Ministry said that Baghdadi was wounded in an airstrike that took place on Saturday in the town of Al-Qaim, which is located about 250 miles away from Mosul. So Iraq's Prime Minister gave no confirmation. The Pentagon gave no confirmation beyond saying that there were airstrikes in Mosul and Al-Qaim. There was allegedly a tweet that was sent out by the ISIS members wishing Baghdadi a speedy recovery, but Flashpoint Partners, which is actually associated with U.S. intelligence, even suggested that the tweet was a fake. So basically we have two different reports coming from two different offices involving two different airstrikes on two different cities on two different days. We got to wonder, how can the same man be wounded twice in two different airstrikes 250 miles away from each other on two different days? So as John McClane would say in Die Hard 2, how can the same shit happen to the same guy twice, right? Was he wounded in the first airstrike and then escaped to join another convoy where he was wounded again? If that's the case, then he's quite the physical specimen there, and he's also traveling on some quite sophisticated interstate highway systems in Iraq, if he could do that. Or, what's more likely? He wasn't wounded at all. And of course the truth certainly came out about that. So one wonders whether or not this was not an attempt to erase Baghdadi from the national consciousness because of the open association that John McCain had with Baghdadi. Remember, John McCain was seen in pictures with Baghdadi. You can see them on my website and Google them, and you can find the photographs. Brandon Turbeville, John McCain, Baghdadi photos. That's your search term. Put those in, you'll find the photos. So perhaps this was an attempt to erase Baghdadi from the narrative, right? Because Baghdadi becomes at some point a liability if his hobnobbing with U.S. senators and members of the IRI and the NED and USAID and all of these other groups, as well as the FSA. Once that gets out there in the national consciousness, it becomes a liability because it becomes a window for the American people to look in and say, wait a minute, perhaps we're not being told the truth here, which is what was beginning to happen for a number of people when they saw those pictures. Well, perhaps this was an attempt to erase Baghdadi, but the story couldn't get reported in a credible fashion with so many differing reports. I'm sure, though, that they could have pushed that hard enough, the American people would have bought it, because at this point a large portion of the public is unable to determine fact from fiction. They're so stuck on Hollywood and stuck on the movies. So speaking of Hollywood, we've got to talk about the beheading. I want to get into the beheading. I think I mentioned the beheading recently on the last show that I did by myself, but let's bring this up. There was an article I did for Activist Post, The Beheading That Never Was, the Kassig Killing, and Western War Propaganda. So we had this latest beheading video that came out, allegedly comes from ISIS, and it shows the beheading of Peter Kassig, who is an American aid worker who was captured by the Western-backed fundamentalists in October of last year, so October 2013. Kassig, we got to look into who Kassig is, and we'll do that in a second. Kassig was an Iraq veteran and former U.S. Army Ranger who later became a quote-unquote aid worker in Lebanon and Syria. That's according to USA Today. Kassig's family is stating that while overseas, Kassig converted to Islam and changed his name to Abdul Rahman. The video, which was released in mid-November, is about 15 minutes long, and it contains a rather long propaganda build-up before showing the beheading of 12 to 18 Syrian soldiers. Now, I should note that 12 to 18 Syrian soldiers were beheaded. They received virtually no press, no outrage, no concern, except that they were only mentioned as a background to Kassig. So Kassig gets beheaded. It's a tragedy. The world should weep. We should go to war. But 12 to 18 Syrians, that doesn't mean anything. That's chicken feed, according to the media. But what's important to point out is that Kassig's beheading was not actually shown. Toward the end of the video, we have this guy, Jihadi John. This is the ISIS member who's acted as the star, and, well, I guess you wouldn't call him the main character, the antithesis, right? The bad guy in the movie. He is pictured standing next to a severed head, which he claims belonged to Kassig. So if Kassig was really beheaded, then his murder is, obviously a tragedy, right? It was an act of brutality, of savagery, of animal behavior. But there's one thing lacking in the narrative that we're being provided by the Western governments and the U.S. media here regarding the beheading, and that is evidence. We don't have any evidence that Kassig was beheaded. All right, so we have the staged Foley beheading, which attempted to depict, which poorly done too, the first few moments of a decapitation. But the Kassig beheading is not a beheading video at all. It's just simply a footage of a man standing next to a severed head that he claims belongs to Peter Kassig. And considering the fact that they just beheaded 18 Syrian soldiers, I would say heads are easy to find in that general area. So, with the exception of Jihadi John's word, we are left with nothing to confirm that the severed head was actually Kassig's. In fact, when you look at the track record of Western governments and the media mouthpieces of Western media outlets, as well as the recent trail of beheading videos out there, we would be well within reason to question the veracity of the claims, right? And that's what we're doing. So at this point, it's impossible for us to know whether or not this head shown in the video truly belonged to Kassig, or if Kassig was beheaded. We don't know for sure whether or not the victims preceding Kassig were truly beheaded. But we can say that the depiction of the beheading shown on the film was entirely staged on these previous videos. We do know that Kassig and his predecessors have been and are being used for war propaganda purposes, right? All of the beheadings that took place at the beginning, Foley video, have conveniently been timed to the needs and the wishes of the NATO agenda. So this really precludes any reasonable suggestion that the videos were anything other than propaganda. Remember, when the United States was debating the idea of becoming more directly involved in Syria and Iraq, militarily involved, particularly in the form of bombing civilian and government infrastructure and openly funding death squads, the video showing the beheading of James Foley was released, which resulted in widespread anger and indignation amongst the U.S. general public. When the British seemed hesitant to directly join the imperialist bombing coalition, a video was released showing the beheading of Alan Henning, who's a British citizen. And then the British got involved, right? When the French seemed hesitant to join the bombing, ISIS releases a third video of a beheading of a Frenchman, right? Which provided justification for French involvement. So all this is convenient timing. Remember, when NATO was considering targeted airstrikes in Syria, but they were concerned about Assad's sophisticated air defense systems, shortly thereafter, ISIS managed to capture Takba Air Base in Raqqa, Syria, which eliminated the air defense systems and left the entirety of the eastern part of the country open to NATO bombing. Remember when NATO was calling for a no-fly zone, a buffer zone, a safe zone. Now it's called an air exclusion zone. Even members of Congress were beginning to question why you need a no-fly zone if ISIS doesn't have an air force. Well, what happens next? ISIS seizes planes and ISIS gets an air force. This is timing that just does not allow us to believe that this is a coincidence. Either ISIS is the dumbest public relations personnel in world history, or they are controlled by NATO for propaganda, geopolitical purposes, and military purposes. And I favor the latter, clearly. Now, let's talk about Kassig. We've only got... I'm going to have to do this on the other side. Yeah, we're going to have to take a break here for station identification. Ladies and gentlemen, stay with us on the other side. We're going to talk about Kassig, and we're going to get into a number of other subjects as well. We'll be right back after this.
Also on ISIS, are the Iranians striking ISIS targets inside Iraq, to your knowledge?
Seeing their reports, we have no indication that the reports are not true, that Iranian aircraft have conducted airstrikes in the last several days against ISIL targets in eastern Iraq.
So you're saying they are true. You would know, the military presumably would know that those reports
We have no indication that they're not true. I have no reason to believe that they're not true, those reports that Iranian aircraft struck targets against ISIL in eastern Iraq. Again, you should consult the Iranian government to speak to the activities of their military. It's the Iraqi airspace and Iraqis to deconflict. We are not coordinating with, nor are we deconflicting with Iranian military.
Iraqi has that kind of air control that they can deconflict airspace between U.S. and Iranian aircraft?
Yes. Yes. It's a sovereign nation.
Yeah, it doesn't mean they're competent.
They're competent enough to deconflict their airspace. Our message to Iran is the same today as it was when it started, and as it is to any neighbor in the region that is involved in anti-ISIL activities, and that's that we want nothing to be done that further inflames sectarian tensions in the country.
For more news, visit pigminews.com.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.TV.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Before the break, we were discussing the Peter Kassig beheading, and I told you that we needed to discuss who Peter Kassig is. And I want to get into that, and we're coming up, this is the second segment of the show, and there's a couple of other things I want to get into, and we'll do that. But let's finish up on Kassig, all right? Kassig is, again, I mentioned the former American military soldier, the former U.S. Army Ranger who became an aid worker, a quote-unquote aid worker. Well, Kassig's humanitarian aid work involves the founding of the Special Emergency Response and Resistance. This is a non-governmental organization, an NGO, that is allegedly focused on delivering aid to areas that, quote, larger organizations could not operate in, end quote. So you got to remember that NGOs, that non-governmental organizations, have not only been responsible for a significant portion of the organization of death squads in Syria, but also for the provision of medical help and other logistical assistance needed to organize and facilitate these destabilization campaigns. Remember, Doctors Without Borders is one such NGO that has been involved deeply in the assisting of death squad fighters in Syria. So, with that being said, you got to mention that the Special Emergency Response and Resistance, the SERR, has received a large portion of its funding from the NGO Conscience International, which is considered an international aid organization that itself receives its funding from the National Endowment for Democracy. So, in other words, this money that's coming to the SERR is being funneled from the National Endowment for Democracy. The National Endowment for Democracy essentially funds the SERR, Kassig's organization. And if you don't know the importance of that statement, then go look at some of my previous articles about the National Endowment for Democracy. Look up the National Endowment for Democracy. Webster Tarpley's book, Obama, the Postmodern Coup, talks a lot about that. Tony Cartolucci has done a number of articles on the National Endowment for Democracy. It's pretty easy to find the history, and of course I've done work on that as well. My book, The Road to Damascus, The Anglo-American Assault on Syria, and a bunch of previous articles that I've done will tell you all about that. So we also got to point out that Kassig himself has expressed sympathy with the death squad fighters. He's done a number of interviews due to his NGO, and there was an interview with Syria Deeply magazine. And this is what Kassig had to say. Sometimes rebels want to know if I will help train people or if I will join the fight. I always tell them no. It is of course not that I do not feel terrible for the civilians that are suffering in Syria, but for an American young man in my position that would be foolish and regarded as such by pretty much everyone, including the opposition. I can either be in a position to deliver tens of thousands of dollars of antibiotics for women and children, or I can be another young man with a gun. Note, he says he feels terrible for the civilians that are suffering in Syria, and that his choices are essentially between providing medicine or picking up a gun and joining the rebels. So basically, Kassig is saying that his political leanings are clear. He expresses sympathy for the death squads, the alleged rebels as painted by the Western media. So Kassig was, you got to ask the question: is Kassig another agent of Western destabilization working under the guise of an NGO or an aid organization? And I think that's clear that he is, or that he was. We don't know if he's still around, but that is Peter Kassig, the death squad supporter and the victim, the alleged victim of a beheading. So we'll see. Now, we got to do another mention of another report that I did on November 26th. Death squads receiving training in joint U.S.-Qatar operation report. There was a report out by Reuters that Western-backed death squad fighters, ISIS-style fighters, right, operating in Syria, are receiving a portion of their training inside Qatar via the Qatari government and via the United States. So we got these unnamed sources from the information that reported to Reuters that the training was taking place near Doha, Qatar, in between the border of Saudi Arabia and the American Al Udeid Air Force Base. That's the largest air base in the Middle East, U.S. air base in the Middle East. Anyway, Al Udeid is inside a military zone protected by Qatari special forces. Now, according to Reuters, these Syrian rebel sources have reported to Reuters that many of the fighters trained in Qatar belong to the Free Syrian Army, which is an umbrella group of death squad fanatics which is passed off as moderates by Western governments. The training that the sources describe has been running close to a year. Reuters stated that the program involved the identification of small groups of jihadists fighting in Syria by the CIA. The CIA essentially identified these groups, that these groups were relocated, the jihadists were relocated to Qatar via Turkey, and the subsequent training began in ambush techniques by the United States and Qatar before the fighters are then shipped back to Syria via Turkey again. So, Reuters admits the training of death squad fighters in the art of ambush. Of course, they tried to claim that the fighters are not trained in IEDs or other more advanced techniques, but we all know that that's bull, because we all know that many of these, what is called ISIS, when ISIS appeared, it was the result of training tens and thousands of hardened fighters in Jordan, which was paid for by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, conducted by the United States, and shipped in through Turkey into Syria. So we've got that on the record as well. So,
90% live in poverty.
Reuters, of course, is attempting to portray these fighters as moderate, as vetted, but Reuters is also forced to admit that Qatar is open and openly does support ISIS against Assad. Right? We have this quote from Reuters. Let's read this. A source who works with rebel groups said Qatar had delivered weapons, mostly mortar bombs, to the Islamic Front and some FSA brigades about 2 months ago, and had paid some salaries for Islamic Front groups. So that's it. Qatar shipping weapons, mortar bombs to the ISIS fighters, paid salaries from the for the Islamic State fighters. So we've got death squad battalions in Qatar. That's not by any means the first recorded instance of Western-operated jihadis training operations, and it's not the largest. As I mentioned before, there was this in European press outlets. It was reported that these highly skilled and organized fighters of the Islamic State that appeared in Iraq and Syria shortly afterwards were being trained in Jordan at the behest of the United States, by the United States, paid for by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Gulf state feudal monarchies, and then shipped into Syria via Turkey. So we've got that on the record there. You can check that out if you like.
71,000 employees around the globe.
Now, just to kind of continue, since we do have
still remains a recipient
significant amount of time left in this segment, I'll try to get through this serious stuff as fast as I can. On November 26, another report from the United Nations, but this one is addressing the issue of civilian deaths at the hand of American airstrikes. The report says there are 50 dead civilians since the start of the campaign. This is what the report says. It says the international coalition continued airstrikes against ISIL in Syria on a near-daily basis, with reports of some 865 people killed, including 50 civilians in Aleppo, Deir el-Zor, Hasaka, Idlib, and Raqqa since strikes began. All right, well, the figure of 50 dead civilians, that is unbelievably low. American airstrikes have been known to target residential neighborhoods. This is not the report, of course, this is me saying that the figures are low, and that Americans have targeted residential neighborhoods in Syria. These neighborhoods filled with innocent civilians. They've killed a number of civilians in just one fell swoop. I'm sorry, the 50 dead civilians is hogwash. This number is much higher than what is being reported. The United States has appeared to have been targeting civilian areas since the beginning of the aerial campaign in Syria.
News, visit pigminews.com.
So bear that in mind. The United Nations must be using the same formula as the Western media outlets used during Vietnam. In other words, any dead human being or any part of a human being, anything that could be construed as being a human being, is considered a dead death squad fighter, but never is it considered a civilian. And these manipulated figures like they were in Vietnam are just reported back to a public who's just dazed and confused and never thinks to question the numbers that's presented to them in the first place. So The real numbers of dead Syrians, of course, are much higher. These numbers are inconsequential, to say the least, to the people who are directing the bombing campaign. And apparently they're also quite acceptable to the humanitarian bombers and the responsibility to protect left-wingers who want to increase the death toll from afar. The Syrian government, of course, has been engaging in airstrikes against ISIS as well, and they've also engaged in airstrikes in the exact same location, in Raqqa. The Syrian Air Force is clearly not targeting civilians, but of course civilians are getting killed. Collateral damage if America does it. But Syrian forces are not targeting civilians intentionally. But when they bomb the death squads in Raqqa, the United States responds with condemnation. It responds with hysteria. It responds with panic, claims of crimes against humanity, and the claims that Assad is intentionally targeting civilians. The Syrian air campaign in Raqqa is alleged to have killed 95 people, although the number of civilians versus the number of death squad fighters, that's not clear, so we don't even know. The U.S. government, I want to point out, is responsible for the deaths of millions of innocent Iraqis, over 100,000 Syrians, thousands of Libyans, tens of thousands of Afghanis, a smattering of other nationalities across the globe, including Americans, by the way. So we have the U.S. State Department spokeswoman Jim Psaki stating that they're horrified by the reports that Assad has engaged in airstrikes against their precious death squad freaks and fanatics, and that Syria killed a dozen civilians, demolished residential areas, that Assad is slaughtering Syrian civilians, that he has callous disregard for human life. She says that Assad has lost all legitimacy to govern. The Syrian regime must be held responsible. Here, let me just read this quote. We've got a couple minutes. We are horrified by the reports that the Assad regime's airstrikes yesterday in Raqqa, Syria, killed dozens of civilians and demolished residential areas. The Assad regime continued slaughter of Syrian civilians further exposes its callous disregard for human life. We've been clear that Assad long ago lost all legitimacy to govern, and that the Syrian regime must be held responsible for its brutality and atrocities against the Syrian people. Syrian Information Minister, this is in quote, Syrian Information Minister Omran al-Zuibi responded by stating that the accusations are, quote, an attempt by the United States State Department to push the world to disregard terrorism crimes through directing incorrect accusations against the Syrian state in the interest of those terrorist organizations. Al-Zuibi points out that the United States government was obtaining all of its information from terrorist organizations like the Islamic State group Jabhat al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate. In other words, the activists say school of journalism, and of course that's exactly what they're doing. Psaki and the State Department are, of course, repeating these tired notions of crimes against humanity and attempting to promote a no-fly zone over Syria as well. So go check that article out. Obama to Assad, stop bombing ISIS and let us bomb civilians. It's up at Activist Post. So let's continue with Syria briefly. I don't want to spend the whole show on Syria tonight, but there's a couple more things I want to mention since we're talking about this no-fly zone. So it appeared about a week ago that there was a stall in the plans to implement a no-fly zone in Syria by the United States and by NATO. Now, I wrote in the articles that I was covering in real time that don't believe it, that the plans for a no-fly zone are not going away. The United States recently, it was stated that NATO was not looking for or looking toward the idea of establishing a no-fly zone in Syria, that was not being considered. And I said in my articles, don't believe that. And I've been proven right again. The United States and Turkey have apparently reached an agreement that will allow the creation of a no-fly zone over Syria. Now, it's not as big as Ankara wanted to begin with. It's not 3/4 of the country, or a third of the country, but it is a sizable portion. It's a no-fly zone nonetheless. All you got to do is declare a no-fly zone, and then you're in a war situation. A no-fly zone will require the United States and NATO to bomb Syria's air defenses and destroy its air force. That's how this stuff works. Now, when it was first being discussed, it was called a no-fly zone or a buffer zone, and now it became a safe zone. Now it's being called an air exclusion zone. So these name changes, right? So this should come as no surprise. It's essentially going to allow for a deeper staging ground for terrorists and death squad operatives who are working inside Syria to more easily overcome Assad's forces. Now, it would essentially be a declaration of war against Assad's military, and this would result, as I said, in the bombing of Syrian air bases and other military installations. It would weaken the Syrian military. It would provide a much-needed second wind for Western-backed terrorists in terms of morale and militarily. It would be essentially Libya 2.0. So let's look. We have U.S. This is a report from the Wall Street Journal. Adam Entus says, quote, U.S. and Turkish officials have narrowed their differences over a joint military mission in Syria that would give the U.S. and its coalition partners permission to use Turkish air bases to launch airstrike operations against the Islamic State targets across northern Syria, according to officials in both countries. As part of the deal, U.S. and Turkish officials are discussing the creation of a protected zone along a portion of the Syrian border that would be off-limits to Assad regime aircraft and would provide sanctuary to Western-backed opposition forces and refugees. U.S. and coalition aircraft would use Incirlik and other Turkish air bases to patrol the zone, ensuring that rebels crossing the border from Turkey don't come under attack there, officials said. Turkey had proposed a far more extensive no-fly zone across one-third of northern Syria, according to officials. That idea was, however, a non-starter for the Obama administration, which told Ankara that something so invasive would constitute an act of war against the Assad regime, end quote. I went through that very fast. I apologize if I went too fast, but notice that they're talking about a joint military mission in Syria that would give the U.S. and its coalition partners permission to use Turkish air bases to launch airstrike operations, and that there would be the creation of a protected zone, safe zone, no-fly zone, buffer zone, along a portion of the Syrian border that would be off-limits to Assad regime aircraft and would provide sanctuary to Western-backed opposition forces. ISIS would provide sanctuary for ISIS. The United States is ISIS's air force. So, again, a few months ago when Turkey and the United States were discussing the possibility of the establishment of a no-fly zone, again, as I said earlier, it was they went from no-fly zone and buffer zone to safe zone. Now it's being called an air exclusion zone. So these synonyms and this semantic game, name changing will just, it'll never end, apparently. They just continue to come up with new and creative names for these things. We got to move on. This is we're running out of time again. All right, so the Bloomberg. This is what Bloomberg has to say. The new proposal would be called an air exclusion zone, a buffer area inside Syria along the Turkish border that would be manned by Turkish troops and protected by U.S. air power, according to 3 senior U.S. officials who have been briefed on the discussions. The goal would be to give some Syria rebels and civilians protection from both Islamic State and the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and increase the flow of humanitarian aid to Syria through the zone. The idea was last floated in 2012 by the French government, and then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was reported to support it at the time. All right, that's end quote. So the air exclusion zone, let's get this clear, has nothing to do with providing humanitarian aid, has nothing to do with protecting civilians from the Islamic State or Assad. Assad is not attacking them to begin with. The establishment of the buffer zone is about creating a new staging ground for terrorists like ISIS and other related organizations to conduct attacks even deeper inside Syria. The NATO alliance, GCC alliance, Israel, the United States intends to create a buffer zone in the north and east of Syria, and it intends to open a third front on the Syrian border with Israel. And this was discussed in assessing options for regime change by the Brookings Institution in 2012. We don't have time to really go into all that in detail, but It's notable that this recent agreement with Turkey regarding the no-fly zones comes on the heels of the ouster of Chuck Hagel, who was one of the few American policymakers, American officials, who did express at least some hesitancy to engage in military strikes against Assad's forces. But the plan now, the fight of the alleged fight against ISIS, which is essentially the war against Assad, is being coordinated by Obama's ISIS czar. And Obama's ISIS czar is General John Allen. Does anybody remember General John Allen? He was the disgraced general who was fired allegedly for thousands of these inappropriate communications with this Jill Kelly, this Florida socialite, former Lebanese woman. And Allen was also tied to the Petraeus affair. Right? Allen is closely allied with Petraeus. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that these individuals, Petraeus and Allen specifically, were ousted for other reasons that necessarily didn't have to do with national security or inappropriate communications or leaking, but that it had more to do with a battle between psychopaths of the American ruling elite. All right, so just infighting essentially against these different groups, these different sects in the American ruling elite. Some more pro-war factions. You could add Petraeus, you could add General Ham, General Allen, versus more restrained, of course, by no means moral, but more restrained members of the elite like Obama, Hagel, General Dempsey, those groups. So it seems that this could actually be the case. And now General Allen, after being ousted, he's back. He is back in power. And by him being back in power, so is the Petraeus connection. So you can throw Petraeus back into the mix. Hagel's gone. Dempsey has been converted. He was apparently more hesitant to engage in military conflict in Syria, but now he's been converted and he's all for it. He's on board, as they say. We've only got a couple minutes left, and I really wish I could do this justice, but I don't have the time. I want you to take a look at what I've been saying all along about these ballot initiatives. Remember, a while back, I did an article, I talked about it on this show, about whether or not you should vote, and the answer was maybe, right, depending on what was going on. And I'm encouraging everyone to drop this damn anarchist lunacy and this stupidity of just pulling out of the system, tuning in, dropping out, firing your joint and just doing nothing productive in society, and somehow that's going to change things. I'm sorry. I don't mean to really break that down into childish terms, but the truth of the fact of the matter is that while there are things you can do as an individual, that simply abstaining from voting altogether when there is a relevant ballot initiative, rejecting any and all government intervention in the affairs of banking and corporations, the allowing of Wall Street to run rampant, all this kind of stuff, this anarchist ideology which was pushed by the powers that be, it was pushed by big bankers, and it was pushed by big government intelligence agencies, whether you want to believe it or not. It's also non-productive. It gets nothing done. It actually works to the ends of Wall Street and the corporations, and you ruin your own living standards. You're pissing in your own drinking water, anarchists, and it's time you wake up and realize that. And for those of you who are still involved, you haven't tuned in and dropped out, then you need to get a bigger set of balls. Your movements need to have more teeth. For instance, we've got the GMO debate. You look at certain areas like Colorado, California, Oregon, Washington. These are places that wanted to have GMO labeling. GMO companies, of course, the Monsanto types, the Dow and a number of others, have come out and spent millions of dollars to defeat these labeling initiatives. But you've also got counties and provinces like Maui and Kauai in, I think that's how you pronounce that, in Hawaii, a county in California that voted to ban GMOs. And this is what I've been saying to begin with. Labeling is great. We want labeling. Sure, I'll support labeling, just the way I support concealed carry. But what we really want is a ban on GMOs. What we really want is total gun rights, total gun freedom. So labeling is something that we should support in the absence of an absolute ban, but an absolute ban is what we should be working for. And I'm telling you right now that this idea that only labeling is what we should ask for is a hatchet job, and it is working against you. This idea of the power of the consumer. Yes, you can influence things by voting with your dollars. I encourage you to do that. But simply leaving things up to the stupid market is working against your own best interests. And in the minute or so that I have left, let me try to demonstrate part of this. Let's look at the GMO situation, right? Who is the leader of the labeling movement, right? We've got the Just Label It group. Now, I'm not going to sit here and attack Just Label It, but I will point out that there's a founding partner of Just Label It, and that is Gary Hirshberg, right? People should look up Gary Hirshberg. He's the CEO of Stonyfield Organics. He's got this love me, hold me, spoon me yogurts and smoothies and butter and all that kind of stuff. But who is Gary Hirshberg? This is the guy that's instrumental in leading your labeling movement. And Hirshberg, let's go back and look at him. He has hosted gatherings for John Edwards. He's hosted gatherings for Barack Obama, and he supported Barack Obama. Now, Obama in the 2008 presidential campaign season went to Hirshberg's house in New Hampshire on a number of occasions, right? This was a sort of a campaign stop for a lot of these candidates. And Hirshberg, I should also mention, if you're not convinced that Obama is Monsanto's man in the White House, then you must not have been paying attention. But this was supported by Hirshberg. There's also the Democratic nomination. Hirshberg's first choice for the Democratic nomination was Tom Vilsack until he dropped out of the race. Now, who is Tom Vilsack? Tom Vilsack became the Secretary of Agriculture under Obama. He is an avid supporter of GMO food. When he was governor of Iowa, Vilsack was given a Governor of the Year award by the Biotechnology Industry Organization. So this is who Hirshberg supported for governor. Now, Hirshberg is a co-chair of an organization called AGREE. Get it? AGREE. The stated objective is to build consensus around solutions to issues facing the food and agricultural system. All right, fine. But AGREE, amongst its foundation partners, has the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. Lots of these foundations are involved, but they all support GMOs. They're all big corporate agriculture. So with friends like this, why do you need enemies? But ask, why is Hirshberg leading the Just Label It anti-GMO campaign? Well, I'll tell you, because he knows it's a dead letter. It doesn't matter. He knows that you can argue for labeling every day if you want, and it's not going to go as far as a ban because people don't understand all of the fight for labeling when they're still going to be faced with GMO foods. It doesn't do anything, so you label it. It's still there. The GMO foods are still there. What Monsanto fears is not necessarily labeling. It fears a ban. And that's why you have so much foundation involvement in the labeling movement. And again, I'm all for labeling. You want to label it? Let's label it. But let's ban it. That's where we need to go. We need to go to the root solution here, and that's the banning of the cultivation of GMO foods. I'm out of time, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk about police brutality next week, hopefully. I didn't get to Ferguson, but I really wanted to, and I didn't get to do really anything other than this brief talk on GMO foods. We'll talk more about GMOs next week, and of course an update on Syria. So hopefully we're caught up on that. So ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. next week, and we'll talk about a number of other issues. This has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville.